going to try my best to not knock over this microphone while I flail, because I use my hands a lot while I speak. I'd like to start by thanking Dr. Green for inviting me to be a part of this series. I really struggled with how to open this talk, so much so that in a moment of true solidarity with you, my students, I really procrastinated on starting this. Part of it is that there's a lot of tension in the title, isn't there? Imagine, for instance, overhearing a conversation between two acquaintances. They're having a conversation, and one of them says something like, oh, well, I'm actually a Christian. And the other person says, still? You'd know that there is a story there, right? There's tension. And there's no shortage of ways to talk about why I'm still a Christian. I could talk about the faith instilled in me since I was a young girl, the community of faith that surrounds me, my hope in Christ's redeeming work, my assurance of my salvation, the way Christ can draw near in difficult times. And because this series has gone on for a year now, maybe longer, you have heard from a number of faculty with really rich messages on all these things. I'd say more about these messages, but they're so good and I don't want to be compared to them. So instead of going down that path today, I'd like to think a little bit about not what it means to still be a Christian, but maybe what it means to still identify as a Christian. In the last few years, I've heard from or about a number of people in their 20s, their 30s, even their 40s, who, while they still believe in the major tenets of Christianity, they struggle with the idea of church attendance or identifying with Christianity at large. In the last decade, they've seen enough behavior of those who call themselves Christians to pause before joining in worship with them, to hesitate before identifying themselves as evangelical Christians. Maybe you've seen this kind of behavior too. You've seen polarization in the church, anger, accusations, fear. You've seen small issues of disagreement blow up into big things, and you've seen big things get minimized and swept under the rug. To be clear, I'm not just talking about politics, though that's part of it. It feels like we're in a cultural moment where just about anything can light the fuse in the powder keg of the church's ugliness. Denominational differences, differences of church practice, labels, vocabulary choice, right? It all feels like fair game. The other night, during a Q&A session with Dr. Zach Eswine, a student described this phenomenon. He was looking for some guidance. The student ended his description of the anger, the accusation, the polarization. He ended it with this question: what has happened to the church? What has happened to the church? I don't think there's anything super new happening here. The church has always been made of sinful people. But I do think there's a seasonality to issues, and it's not a pretty season we're in. And our access to national media has lent us the illusion of thinking we know about the church, like big picture as a whole. And it can be hard sometimes to stomach what we see. It can be sometimes hard for me to stomach what I see. A few years ago, after having a few years of what felt like this rising clamor in online and public spaces, a few years of watching high-profile Christians and pieces of the church make decisions I had a hard time agreeing with, I remember asking our own Stephanie Fermenti, am I too old to feel disillusioned with the church? I didn't think I had any illusions left to lose. But I did. I had illusions left to lose, and I found in my heart that I needed to find a way to move towards the church and not away. I saw in others that they needed to find a way to move towards the church and not away. So before I get into the heart of what I want to talk about this morning, I need to make two little caveats. First, I think it's clear that I'm talking about the church, big picture, and not my local congregation, before you start wondering just how much can be happening under one roof. And the second is a caveat about scale. There are obviously some actions by those in the church that are so harmful and so dark that my best bet is to trust God's justice, that he will eventually make all things right. And there are other things that are annoying to me personally, but about which I really might be wrong. My heart is pretty petty, you guys. But I'm trying to talk about the things that are in between. Actions and attitudes that may actually be harmful to the church's reputation and may make us question our association with it, but about which I fundamentally know I need to find a way to reconcile myself to those who take those actions and who hold those attitudes. You may define those boundaries in different places than I do, but I think we all have that range. Okay, so what do we do with this kind of hurt? The hurt that prompts us to ask, what happened to the church? And here's the crux of what I want to communicate to you guys this morning. It is harder for me to hold in my heart the need, the imperative to love and serve the church in all its flaws, to give grace when needed, receive correction when needed. It's harder for me to do those things when I think of the church in the abstract, as a faceless group, rather than when I'm thinking about it as made of individuals, one at a time. And I'm going to say that again. It's harder for me to love and serve the church when I think of it in the abstract, as a faceless group, than when I'm thinking of it as made as individuals, one at a time. And there are a few pieces to that. So first, the first way to make sure we understand the church is made of individuals is by reminding ourselves that the church is made up of the ones we love. Do you have a faithful friend, a co-follower of Jesus? Do you have a friend who, when something is frustrating, can sympathize and then help you laugh it off? Who tries to live their life in a way that honors Jesus and is also deeply human? Who can tell you things like, God is bigger than this problem, and he's got you, and I'm praying for you, and also sends you the best social media reels of animals being clumsy? Like, do you have a friend like that? I do. Those friends point me to Jesus and make life lighter, right? Those friends are the church. Faculty, staff, they're the church. Jay Green, John Plating, Tabitha and Kelly Kapik, Emmy Thompson. Emmy, who before she joined us at Covenant this year, was a middle school youth leader at Lookout Mountain Presbyterian Church. And I was so impressed as a member there with the way she gave so much of her life to the middle school kids of our church, including, no kidding, driving a car full of middle school boys 8 hours to Florida for camp. I wouldn't do that. And one of them was my son. That's right, Emmy. But she did. She did it for the sake of Christ and his kingdom and those boys' lives. And that reminds me that to identify with a group of people isn't just identifying with the worst of them, but the best. We are surrounded by such a large crowd of witnesses to the life of faith. Identifying and analyzing and watching the church means identifying with and analyzing and watching these guys too. They're the church. And the more we remind ourselves of that, the better off we are. Second, there's a corollary to this one. Just as it is good to recognize that the ones we love are part of the church, so it's also good to love the ones we recognize as part of the church. The more I know those I disagree with, the easier it is to love and understand them. Really quickly, I'd like to back up and tell you a little story, an extended metaphor. For the first 6 or 7 years that we lived in Chattanooga, my husband and I lived in St. Elmo. We lived in a little house at the top of the ridge with our dog, and we had an important ritual. In all seasons, we would take our dog for a morning walk, down the ridge onto the alley, down a few blocks, and then back up to our house, completing a nice loop that got us warmed up and ready for the day. We did this for years, and eventually we added to our family, and we pushed a stroller while we walked. And one element of our walk, particularly with our own dog with us, meant that people who left their dogs in their yards in the early morning hours, well, those dogs would bark at us. The dogs would see us coming a long ways off. They'd start barking. They'd bark while we approached the house, bark as we walked along the fence line, and barked as we walked away. And a thing I noticed that if it was a stranger's dog, I hated it. Those dogs were jerks. When it was an acquaintance's dog, I tolerated it. Like, I guess this dog means well. And if it was a friend's dog, I loved it. And this still happens today in our current neighborhood. A friend's dog's barking. Oh, he wants to say hi. How sweet that he likes us. Good thing I have treats in my pocket. A stranger's dog, as I walk by, trashy, right? I don't know. It's just important to air your hypocrisy in front of hundreds of people. But the dog walk principle is strongly at work in the church principle as well. When I see Christians behaving counter to what I think are Christian beliefs, and sometimes doing it in the name of Christ, whether that's online or in person, it's hard. But the more I know the person, the less outraged I feel. And to not just learn about all the pieces of their lives, but to pray with them as a body, quietly or in unison, to worship together and be reminded that God inhabits the praises of his people. And listen, I don't want to act like this is an easy thing. I've heard of a number of families who are estranged from each other over politics or denominational choices, people who feel like their loved ones have been radicalized. It's not just a matter of knowing them better. And to those in that situation, I say, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I think that there are better ways to act in that situation than others, but it's not really what I'm talking about here. We're made to be in community. People are complicated. Your neighbors don't just need your love and hospitality, they probably offer you their love and hospitality. The more we get to know these neighbors, these fellow churchgoers and their complexity, the harder it is to reduce them to their least palatable attributes. Third, if it's helpful to build empathy for the people in our lives who are making it hard to love the church, then it's possible, likely, we need to build empathy for the people who are not in our lives, and yet somehow still making it hard to love the church. Empathy is a one-to-one action, and it requires imagination. Here's a real example from my own life. As I have taken on different leadership roles at the college, I've been so grateful to have chances to serve this institution that I love so much. But one of the things that has come with that leadership is the opportunity to hear more from the college's critics. And I have a very vivid memory of sitting in a meeting around a table and being handed a printout of all the mean things people were saying online about Covenant. And I thought, like, that's great, just all on one page, all together. It hurt my feelings, right? For this story, it doesn't matter what they were angry about. What matters is that they were fellow Christians being mean and angry about a thing that I really love. But as a member of Christ Church, I have to find a way to say, yeah, I'm with them. And let me tell you that the answer was not to get to know them better by reading more of their content on the internet. I tried that. It didn't work. Instead, I had to remember that they were individuals representing only their singular view, right? And not the position of the church universal, as quick as my mind goes to that. I had to imagine my way into empathy. Imagine my way into Christ's love for them. I had to love the church I have, not the one I sometimes wish I had. Which brings me to my fourth point. Shoot, I'm the church too. There's no greater distraction from our own sin than the sin of others. And yet, if we let it be, that awareness and frustration with others' sin can serve as a powerful reminder of our own. I can be unkind and lack generosity. I am often missing the eternal perspective. And I'm sure I am confidently wrong about a number of things. And just as much as I have to throw my lot in with the church, still, so they have to throw their lot in with me. So, to summarize before my final point, it's easy and even natural to feel wary of the church in the abstract, particularly with our cultural challenges, with a media environment that is constantly widening our scope of awareness, but only including the very worst, the most sensational stories. So it's easy to feel wary of the church, but I need to remember, these guys are the church. You guys are the church. Steph Rementi, Brad and Kelly Boyles, They're the church. And even when those who are close make it hard for me to love them, the answer is actually to draw closer, to make them, though they're obviously specific, make them more specific still, even less abstract. What are their kids doing these days? What's growing in their gardens? And for the nameless and the faceless, those who are far away geographically but brought near through technology, like the wonder or the curse of it, I often don't know, right? I have to use my imagination. I have to imagine myself into that same space with them. And through it all, I have to remain deeply aware of my own sin. Listen, I'm aware that much of this can feel like I've reduced a lot of your pain about the contemporary church into platitudes, right? Like, want to love the church? Here's one weird trick. Forgive me if I have veered too close to that. I know it's complicated, and I know it's easier said than done. But here's what holds it together for me. Those who are listening astutely may hear me and realize that in some sense I'm talking about embodiment, incarnation. We serve a God who did not remain abstract, but made himself a person in one body, and who calls us to not know the entire church at once with all its flaws, but to worship in an actual congregation, to have an actual circle of neighbors. He wants to help us with this, and we need to ask him for his help in this, so that together with all the saints, and that's an important piece, right? With all the saints, we can grasp how wide and long and high and deep is the love of Christ. And he is with us there still. Thank you.